Last year I dabbled in some 3D printing, but I didn't really go much further than printing off some conversion bits or individual models. But over the last 12 months or so, since I last really looked into this side of the hobby, there seems to have been an explosion in the models that are available. So what better way to explore this range than by 3D printing and painting up a full 2000 point army. I've been playing around with a few armies in the War Scroll Builder, and one that I really wanted to try out was a small but hyper elite Slaves to Darkness force. This consisted of Archaon, 9 Vanguard, a Sorcerer, and a Demon Prince. With this all mapped out, I just needed to pick out which files would work for representing these on the tabletop. The first miniatures that I found were these Dire Knights from Gamak. These are pretty much perfect for representing the elite cavalry of the Vanguard. The set came with 3 different sculpts and a few weapon options and cost me about $30 for the files. Considerably less than the lofty $100 that the original plastic kit costs, especially when you factor in that I could print these out as many times as I wanted. So I downloaded them and opened them up in Chittybox to get my print ready. The files were also handily pre-supported, so I just needed to get things arranged on the plate. I'd already configured Chitterbox for my Elegoo Saturn printer that I would be using, so I just needed to slice it and drop the resulting .ctb file onto a USB drive, plug it into the printer, and hit print. I have covered this whole process in a little more depth in a previous video, so if you're interested in getting more info on what each of these steps actually involves, I'll include a link to that above. I'll also drop my Saturn print settings in the description in case you want to replicate my results. After leaving the printer alone for around about 7 hours, I came back and I now had 3 Vanguard where once there was only liquid resin. Of course, this is an MSLA printer which performs a series of exposures into a vat of photosensitive resin which causes the liquid to harden. The plate steadily moves upwards, building the model up from the bottom through a series of tiny steps, leaving you these upside down models. I removed this from the build plate and dipped them into some IPA, which is used for washing away any excess resin. After leaving them to soak for a bit, I then removed the supports. These are designed to be fairly easy to remove, and with just a bit of pressure, they come away quite easily. What I was left with just needed to be left out in the sun or under a UV light for a bit to ensure that the surface had fully hardened. After cleaning and curing the prints, this is what I was left with. For the most part, I didn't need to do much additional prep other than filing down a few of the contact points, which brings up another benefit of 3D printing. While the print can take hours, I don't need to babysit it. I can be off working on something else rather than clipping, scraping, filing and gluing together kits that consists of dozens of individual fiddly parts. As each of these Dire Knights only consisted of 4 parts each, the head, each hand and the rest of the body, supergluing all 9 together was a pretty simple job. I did have one problem though. The Dire Knights didn't come with any bases. Now I could have gone out and bought some of these, but I thought in for a penny, in for a pound, and just printed some off instead. These files are easily available for free or for very little cost on places like Thingiverse and come in all the correct sizes I needed for my army to be tabletop legal. However, instead of using my Saturn for this, I printed them on my Ender 5 FDM printer instead. The detail on these wasn't as an important factor, and it meant that printing them wouldn't interfere with the print times of my other models. Once these had been printed off, I superglued the riders to their bases. Finally, to finish off these, I created a simple basing scheme which consisted of a few lumps of ripped up cork floor tile to represent the rocks. These were glued to the base and I filled in the rest of the space using some textured paste. With the rank and file of my army completed, I could begin to work on the characters. The lieutenants of my army, the Khorne Demon Prince and the Sorcerer, were both sourced from Bestarium minis. They have tons of these really cool grimdark designs that work particularly well as proxies for Chaos. For my Demon Prince, I settled on this Lacrimator, which is also part of their Mythicon Gladiators bundle. I quite like the idea of picking a more human looking model as a Demon Prince, especially as I will be devoting him to Khorne. He was also about the right size for a Demon Prince, which would give him that presence on the battlefield. For his base, I created a rocky mound for him to stand upon using the same ripped up cork floor tiles as before, and following this up by adding a pleasing amount of skulls to the base. To ensure that the model had a good, strong bond, I drilled a hole into the underside of the right foot and then through the cork and the base before pinning the model into place with some assistance of some steel wire and some super glue. Finally, more textured paste was used to fill in some of the remaining gaps between the cork rocks. For the sorcerer, I selected another Bestarian miniature, specifically Yorick Firespeaker, who is also found in the Corrupted Ambrosia pack. I was drawn to this guy's pointy wizard's hat and immediately thought of him as some sort of Chaos Corrupted Rincewind. This particular model consisted of two halves, his base and the rest of him. The base wasn't necessary, but I really liked the pillars of fire rising up around him. It also meant that I didn't need to do anything else other than glue the two parts to a 32mm base. When it came to selecting something to represent Archaon, I knew that I needed something big and imposing to act as my centerpiece, but I wasn't determined to directly mimic the original model. In my search, I came across lots of great sculpts, but what really drew my eye were the creations of Lord of the Print, specifically the Draco Cerberus. Although this beastly creation was without wings and a rider, I felt that the three heads and the bulk would be more than enough to qualify this as an Archaon proxy. After printing, I had a bit of work to do to get some of the parts to fit properly. For the most part, the legs attached without much issue, but lining up the three separate heads against each other and the body proved tricky. I began by sanding and shaving down the resin, which I'd recommend wearing a mask for, to get as close as possible to a flush fit and gluing the arms and heads to the torso. This inevitably left a few gaps, which meant that I had to cut and roll out some green stuff. I stretched this out into thin sausages and pressed the putty into any of the gaps in the joins. Make sure that you use plenty of water or Vaseline here to ensure that the putty doesn't stick to your tools or your fingers. Some areas just needed a small gap to be filled, but others required a little more work. Around the spines, I had some larger gaps, which meant that I had to sculpt on a few of the scales. It was probably the most prep work that I'd done for any of these models, but was probably still less than the time it would take me to build something comparable like a Maw Crusher. Once the gaps had been filled, I could move on to the base. The Draco Cerberus came with a rocky outcrop for it to perch upon, but this was considerably smaller than the 160mm round base that Archaon would normally be perched upon. So, after gluing the outcrop to the base, I used more green stuff to help blend the rim into the rest of the base. I then added more cork rocks, which I tore up and positioned to match the texture of the outcrop, helping to incorporate the model into the whole base. Finally, a few skulls were dotted around before texture paste was used around the very edges and between the rocks. With everything printed, built and based, all that I was left to do was to paint it all. I began with the primer. As always, this important first step ensures that you have a surface that is ready to take paint and also gives everything a consistent colour. The scheme I will be applying here is quite dark in tone, so I began with some of Pro Acryl's black-brown primer and applied this through my airbrush along with a little flow improver. When picking a scheme for this army, I wanted something that was atmospheric but also quick to paint. After spending a lot of time painting on my Sylvaneth, I wanted something that was a little more straightforward and would allow me to quickly get these models on the table while still looking good. Which is when I was reminded of some of the excellent work that Ken put into his Cursed City miniatures over on his channel, Collective SG. He used a strong red OSL effect across the models, which really gave them this dark and sinister tone, something that would be perfect for my Chaos army. Using this as a jumping off point, I began with some burnt red from the Pro Acryl range. I added some to my airbrush alongside some airbrush thinner to help smooth out its application. With this done, I targeted each of my models from their right hand side and from a slightly lower angle. By sticking to this relative position, I was essentially mimicking the effect of a light source from the same angle. As I sprayed the red paint, it only fell onto the surfaces that faced towards this imaginary light source. Once I'd made a few passes, again keeping the angle and direction of the spray consistent, this built up to create the appearance that the strong red light is being cast onto the model's right hand side. The intensity of this light was built up by using some of the brighter, bold Pyrrole Red. Again, this was applied through my airbrush and was sprayed from the same angle. This time, however, I applied the paint a little more selectively, focusing on the more prominent points of the model that sat closer to the origin of the light. This helped to create a gradient of intensity and mimic the effect of light fall off across the model's surface. I then switched over to the opposite side of the model and gave it a spray of coal black. Instead of painting this side like I would do a regular model, I decided to instead cast a blue light effect onto it. This would not only keep the painting time down, but it would also create a strong contrast between both the red and blue colours, but also the warmer and cooler tones. Which is why it was important to use the black here. The black-brown primer had a warmer tone, so I needed to get things to a more neutral state before I added my blue. The blue light was added by first mixing together some coal black with some turquoise to create this greyish blue tone. Much like the previously applied burnt red, I didn't want to go straight to the brightest colour possible here, but instead build up the gradient slowly. Like with the last step, I held my airbrush directly opposite the position I had applied the red from, spraying from the left side of the model and from a higher angle. If this is done correctly, then the two colours shouldn't overlap, as they should only be visible from the angle that they were originally sprayed from. The blue light was then brightened up with a few sprays of a pure turquoise, which again were focused onto the more prominent parts of the model. I then gave everything a gloss varnish. This was in part intended to seal in the first few layers of paintwork, but it was also intended to give me a nice smooth surface in which to apply some washes too. Matte surfaces tend to soak up the wash a bit more and can result in a staining effect, so using a gloss varnish helps to direct the wash to where you need it to go, into those recesses. Speaking of which, I then created an extremely thin wash using some transparent black mixed in with a little airbrush thinner, but regular old water can also be used here instead. This was then applied over the model with the intention of darkening down the recessed areas. The airbrushing had softened a few of the details, so to bring these back I needed to create a little contrast between the deepest recesses and the raised details, and this wash was a great place to start. This was then followed up with some dry brushing. Dry brushing is a technique that allows you to apply paint to raise details quickly and easily. To do this, take a large brush like this one here and dip it into your paint like normal. Then you need to wipe the brush onto a piece of paper towel to work the paint evenly through the bristles and to remove any excess paint. When this brush is applied lightly over the surface of the model, the paint will start to accumulate only on the raised edges. By using a brighter paint than the base coat, like the orange I'm using here, it creates a stronger level of contrast between the details and the shadows, helping to create depth in the model. This orange, keeping on theme of the lighting effect, was focused around the areas that I'd sprayed with red paints earlier on. This technique was then repeated using some sky blue on the opposite side of the model, helping to add detail to the areas of the model that were lit by the blue light. By this point, I completed both the blue and red sides of the model, but I found that I needed at least one detail to help tie the two halves together and to create a focal point. Something that all models have and is a natural focal point are the eyes. I felt that a bright glowing eye would fit the theme and would also be pretty easy to pull off. I began with some slightly watered down orange and used it to paint in and around the eye socket. I started to brighten this up by first painting the whole of the eyeball with some golden yellow, before finishing off the glow with just a small dot of bold titanium white in the center. And with that, the models were done. They just needed a coat of matte varnish to take away any remaining glossiness, and I was left with the following. And here we have my fully 3D printed 2000 point Chaos army. After building my Sylvaneth, I really wanted to tackle another army, just so I had some options for my games, but I didn't want to spend the best part of another 2 months building, converting and painting things up to a good standard. But by 3D printing and choosing a quick color scheme, I was able to build this army from nothing in just over a week, spending only a few hours each day actively working on it. But not only did I save myself a whole bunch of time, but also a lot of money. Had I brought all of these kits from Games Workshop, it would have set me back about $525. For the files and resin used to print them, this army cost me around $100 instead. Now of course this isn't factoring in the cost of the printer itself, and this is a necessary investment, but if I did include the printer for this calculation, then I would ignore the fact that I could go and use it to print off another 4 or 5 armies worth of models in the future. Now while the quality of the prints is pretty high, which was helped by the 4K screen on the Saturn, they don't have quite the same level of detail and options to customize as plastic kits do. This is probably most apparent on the Dire Knights. While they are very similar to the Vanguard, the plastic kit does have a bit more detail and variation across the armor, shields and weaponry. There is also the fact that this army could never be used at any event or store run by Games Workshop. Personally though, that's not a problem and was never my intention when building this army. I just wanted something that I could play at my local club or an independent tournament. I made sure that everything was based and proportioned correctly, and I imagine that most opponents wouldn't mind facing off against it. So if you're interested in printing off these models yourself, I'll include links to all the models that I use in the description below. I'll also include some affiliate links there, which will include all the paints used in this video, so if you're looking to try out some of these things for yourself, while supporting me in the process, then I would be extremely grateful. Speaking of which, let me just say a huge thank you to my ever generous supporters. Currently my top supporters on Patreon are Jonathan Hart, Berserker, Daniel Dowling, Dakota the Destroyer, Jake, Jeremy Kaup, Jesse Smith, Casper Lindberg, Lyconian Primarch, Merrick, Mr. Grimm, Swedsman, and Tim. So a big thank you to you guys, and if you also support me on Patreon, buy me a coffee, or you just use my affiliates links, then it is the ever generous people such as yourselves that allow me to fund the equipment required to build bigger projects such as this. And so until next time, thanks for watching, and goodbye.